wind howls through the trees, carrying with it the scent of decay and the faint whispers of forgotten souls. In the distance, the towering gates of the old cemetery creak open, as if inviting you in, or perhaps warning you to stay away. The fog rolls in thick, swallowing the gravestones and casting long shadows that seem to move on their own. This is a place where the boundary between life and death is thin, where the dead do not rest and the living are not welcome. As you step inside, the air grows colder and the silence becomes deafening. You can feel it, the weight of unseen eyes upon you, watching, waiting. Something stirs beneath the earth, something ancient and restless. And now you've crossed into their domain. Prepare yourself, for what lies ahead will test your grip on reality. The ghosts of the graveyard are awakening, and they have a story to tell. But beware, once you hear their whispers, there's no turning back. The cemetery stood before you, ancient and imposing, its iron gates creaking loudly as you pushed them open. The cold air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. As you took your first steps inside, a chill settled into your bones. The tombstones, some barely visible under the weight of years, leaned at odd angles as though tired of standing vigil over the dead. The fog wrapped around your legs, swirling with every movement, pulling you deeper into the maze of stone and shadow. You told yourself it was just an old graveyard, but a creeping dread began to gnaw at the back of your mind, whispering that this was no ordinary place. Then, without warning, you heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. You paused, straining to listen. At first, it was barely audible, a soft murmur just on the edge of your perception. But as you stood there, frozen in place, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from all around you, from the ground beneath your feet, from the ancient graves themselves. The voices spoke in a language you didn't understand, their tone urgent, almost desperate. You wanted to run, but something held you there, as though the voices were pulling you in, demanding you listen. As you moved deeper into the cemetery, the fog thickened, swirling around the gravestones like an ancient spirit guarding the dead. The air was unnervingly still, as though time itself had stopped within these haunted grounds. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against your back. You couldn't shake the feeling that you were being watched. The tombstones seemed to lean in closer, their inscriptions worn away by centuries of neglect. The silence was deafening, save for the occasional rustle of the dead leaves underfoot. It felt as though the graveyard itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then, in the corner of your eye, you saw something, a shadow slipping between the gravestones, too fast to focus on. Your breath caught in your throat as you froze, eyes darting toward the spot where you thought you saw movement. But there was nothing, just the thick, unyielding fog and the cold stone markers of the dead. You told yourself it was just your imagination, but deep down, you knew better. You felt it, a presence, unseen, but very much there, lurking just beyond your reach. And it was watching you, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. As you ventured further into the heart of the cemetery, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just the eerie stillness or the thick fog that unnerved you. It was the oppressive weight of unseen eyes that seemed to track your every move. Your footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence, and each breath felt like a betrayal in this world of the dead. You glanced over your shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the graveyard remained as empty as ever. Yet you could feel it, the unmistakable sensation of eyes locked on you, watching, waiting. The whispers returned, this time louder and more distinct. They swirled around you like a cold wind, circling closer and closer. The words were clearer now, though still incomprehensible, as though the voices were speaking an ancient language long forgotten by the living. You turned in place, scanning the gravestones in the thick fog, but there was nothing, no one. Still, the whispers persisted, growing more insistent with each passing second. It felt as though they were trying to communicate with you, to tell you something urgent. A warning, perhaps? But why? And from whom? The ground beneath your feet felt unsteady, as if it were alive with movement you couldn't see. Every step seemed to sink deeper into the soft earth, and you began to hear something, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was a low, guttural sound, rising from beneath the soil. You froze, your heart pounding in your chest as you strained to hear. The noise grew louder, a chorus of whispers, muffled but clear, as though the voices were coming from the graves themselves. You knelt, pressing your hand against the cold, damp ground. And there it was, the unmistakable sound of voices calling to you from below. The whispers from the earth became clearer, and your blood ran cold. They were calling your name. Panic surged through you as you stumbled backward, your foot catching on an overgrown root. How could they know your name? You had told no one you were coming here. And yet, the voices continued, growing louder and more insistent with every passing moment. The ground beneath you seemed to shift as if something or someone was trying to reach up from the soil. Desperation clawed at your chest as you turned to leave, but the whispers followed, relentless, as if demanding your attention. The fog had thickened to the point where it was difficult to see more than a few feet in front of you. The gravestones appeared out of the mist like skeletal hands reaching up from the earth, their inscriptions worn and illegible. You wandered between the rows, running your fingers over the cold stone, trying to decipher names that had long since faded away. It was as if the dead buried here had been erased from history, forgotten by time and abandoned by the living. A deep sense of melancholy settled over you, as though the weight of their forgotten lives was pressing down on your soul. And then you saw it, one gravestone that stood out among the rest. Unlike the others, its inscription was clear, the name perfectly legible despite the wear of time. Your heart skipped a beat as you read it. It was your own name. The letters stared back at you, etched into the cold stone as though they had been waiting for you to discover them. A chill ran down your spine, and you stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the roots tangled in the earth. The ground felt unsteady beneath your feet, as though something beneath it was stirring, waiting for you to fall. As you tried to steady yourself, a sound pierced through the fog. A cry, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't the cry of an animal or a person, but something far more chilling. It was the unmistakable sound of an infant's wail, echoing through the graveyard like a ghostly lament. The sound sent a wave of cold dread through your body. There was no one else here, you were certain of that. Yet the cries persisted, rising and falling in mournful waves, as though the very air was weeping with sorrow. You followed the sound, your legs moving against your will, drawn toward the source of the haunting cry. The fog seemed to part for you, revealing a small, forgotten grave tucked away in the farthest corner of the cemetery. The headstone was small, barely noticeable, but as you knelt to examine it, you saw the faint inscription, a date, and nothing more. The cries grew louder, and the ground beneath the grave shifted, as if something beneath it was moving, trying to break free. Panic surged through you as the wails reached a fever pitch. You stumbled backward, your breath ragged as the fog closed in again, swallowing the grave and the terrifying cries that came from within. The night grew darker, the fog thicker, and the air colder as you ventured deeper into the cemetery. The oppressive silence felt heavier now, as though the very atmosphere around you was thickening, suffocating. As you took another cautious step, the ground beneath your feet trembled slightly, barely noticeable at first. Then, without warning, the earth cracked open with a sharp, deafening noise. You stumbled backward, heart racing as you watched a dark rift tear through the ground before you, a jagged opening that seemed to pulsate with an eerie energy. A cold wind rushed from the rift, carrying with it faint whispers, voices from another world. You stood frozen in place, the air around you buzzing with an unnatural hum. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling before your eyes. The rift seemed to stretch wider, revealing a blackness so deep and endless that it felt as though you were staring into the void itself. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and for the first time you felt true terror. This was no ordinary graveyard. This place was a bridge between the worlds of the living and the dead, and the barrier between them was crumbling. The voices that poured from the rift grew louder, clearer, and more desperate. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were pleas, urgent and filled with fear. They warned you, begged you to turn back before it was too late. Yet despite the dread building in your chest, you felt an irresistible pull toward the gaping darkness. Something in the rift beckoned you, calling to you with a power that defied reason. Your feet moved forward without thought, as if controlled by some unseen force. Each step brought you closer to the edge, and the air around you grew colder, the wind biting at your skin like icy claws. You wanted to listen to the warnings, to turn and run, but your body refused to obey. The rift hummed with malevolent energy, its dark maw growing wider and deeper as if it were preparing to swallow you whole. Just as you reached the edge, the whispers stopped, and for a brief moment, the world fell eerily silent. Then a voice, clearer and more distinct than any before, spoke directly into your mind. It's too late. You've already crossed the line. Your heart pounded in your chest as the realization hit you. Whatever was on the other side was no longer waiting for you to come. It was coming for you. Night had fully descended, and the cemetery, already shrouded in mist, was now cloaked in an unsettling darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, each breath you took condensing in the freezing air. The fog thickened around you, and your world became nothing more than vague silhouettes of tombstones and twisted trees. It was in this suffocating darkness that the shadows began to gather. At first, they were barely noticeable, subtle movements out of the corner of your eye, fleeting and ghostly. You told yourself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, you knew the truth. Something was stirring in the graveyard. The shadows moved with purpose, coalescing into forms that became more defined with each passing moment. These were no ordinary shadows. They had shape, faces, distorted and hollow, as if they had been ripped from the bodies they once inhabited. They flickered in and out of view, merging with the darkness before appearing again, closer each time. Panic surged through your veins, and your pulse quickened. The shadows were circling you, closing in, as if drawn to the life still clinging to your flesh. The dead had awoken, and they were no longer content with being forgotten. From the thick fog, a figure began to take form, far more solid than the fleeting shadows that haunted your peripheral vision. It was distant at first, but the shape moved steadily toward you, becoming clearer with every step. As the figure approached, you felt a cold sweat break out on your skin. There was something eerily familiar about this presence, something that sent a deep, primal fear coursing through you. When the figure emerged fully from the fog, your breath caught in your throat. It was a face you recognized, someone you had lost long ago, someone you thought was gone forever. The figure's features were gaunt, pale, and lifeless, their eyes hollow and fixed on you with an intensity that made your blood run cold. Their clothes were tattered and stained with the dirt of the grave, but there was no mistaking who they were. Your mind raced, trying to rationalize what you were seeing, but deep down you knew the truth. This person, this ghost from your past, wasn't alive. They had been dead for years, buried beneath the very ground you stood upon. Yet here they were, standing before you, more real than the fog and shadows surrounding you, their face twisted in a horrifying blend of sorrow and rage. The fog shifted once again, but this time it revealed something unexpected. Through the dense mist, a figure appeared, a man, hunched and aged, holding a lantern that cast a dim, flickering light across the graves. His face was gaunt, weathered by years of isolation, and his eyes gleamed with a knowledge that made your skin crawl. You realized with a shiver that this was the gravekeeper, a man whose presence had long been forgotten, along with the cemetery itself. He approached slowly, his movements deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of the dead souls buried beneath him. "You shouldn't have come here," the gravekeeper rasped. His voice cracked and dry, as though it had been years since he last spoke. His eyes bore into yours, filled with sorrow and terror that you couldn't quite place. "This place, it's not for the living anymore. The dead don't rest here, not like they should." His words were a warning, but it was too late. The barrier between the worlds had weakened, and now the spirits were waking, pulling themselves out of the darkness. The gravekeeper knew this. He had tried to stop it, but now, as the shadows shifted and the dead stirred, you realized he had failed. The gravekeeper's warning echoed in your mind, but there was no turning back now. The rift had opened, the spirits had awoken, and the shadows were closing in. You could feel the oppressive weight of the dead pressing in on you, their cold presence crawling under your skin. The lantern light flickered, casting grotesque shadows across the graves, and you realized that this was your final stand. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The cemetery, the fog, the rift, it had all become one, merging into a twisted reality where the living had no place. The gravekeeper raised his lantern higher, casting a weak light that barely held back the darkness. "They're coming for you now," he muttered, his voice thick with resignation. "Once they've seen you, there's no escape." You could hear them, the whispers, the cries, the low moan of the forgotten souls who had been waiting for this moment. The ground trembled beneath your feet, and the fog swirled with increasing violence as the shadows moved closer. You had one choice left: to fight or to surrender to the cold embrace of the graveyard. The dead were hungry and they were coming for you. Are you craving more spine-chilling tales? Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to never miss a new story. Join us for more terrifying journeys into the unknown, where suspense and horror lurk around every corner. And don't forget to share your thoughts and suggestions for our next video in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned, if you dare,